Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining our coffee chat, our EDC coffee chat. We really appreciate you being with us this morning, and we are honored to have on both Representative Steve Tharinger and Representative Mike Chapman from the 24th District, the morning after the election night. So just a quick few items before we kick this off. If you'll please put your Zoom on mute so we don't inadvertently pick up any background noise. And we will let our two representatives present. And we can also talk about some of the other races, of course. It looks like Bruce Emery, Director of Community Development, has a strong lead. It also looks like Mike French, who is currently a sitting city councilman at the city of Port Angeles, has a lead in front of the incumbent Bill Peach, and then also about, last I looked, about an 800 count lead that Ken Hayes has over Will Purser for the Clallam PUD position. And trying to think if I've forgotten any of the other races. Well, of course, at the federal level, Senator Murray looks like she will be reelected. Derek Kilmer has a commanding lead. Steve Hobbs, the Democratic former senator who was the chair of the Transportation Committee that our governor offered the position of Secretary of State to, presumably to get him out of the transportation chair position, has a lead over the independent Julie Anderson. And then let's see, I think, and Brian King is leading by a large majority over Mark Titterness for the position of sheriff. And that pretty much covers the positions that were up locally and at the state and federal level that we all had an opportunity to vote on. So with that, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we will call on you. So Steve and Mike, who would like to kick it off?
Go ahead, Mike.
Well, usually you lead off as the senior member, so.
Well, I would just say, when you look, obviously want to thank everybody for their vote and for their sort of, confidence in us and the work we're doing. I think it's important to note, we have a very balanced district. We have a large district. We have a politically diverse district. Obviously, Washington's a blue state, and our caucus is the majority caucus in Olympia. But I just think it's important that in these sort of swing rural districts that there's Democrats elected, because that brings that voice into that caucus. If you look at like the 24th or the 42nd, and some of these districts where Democrats have won this cycle, that brings a balanced voice into the majority caucus. And I think Mike and I really assume that role. And it's partly because of our district, and it's partly just because of our pragmatic approach to politics. So that's encouraging. I think that also, if folks track the congressional race for Kim Schreier, I think that's the same, right? There aren't that many, purple districts, or there aren't that many, contested districts. A lot of them are either, they're districted into where it supports one party or the other. So the districts where there is it's kind of a balance and it's a competitive district, getting voices out of those districts into the majority caucus, I think, is important. So, we have a very engaged district. If you look at the number of votes that Mike and I got, the total number of votes, it's greater than a lot of other, legislators across the state, because not only is our district diverse politically, but it's also engaged, and that's good. And that's, that keeps Mike and I on our toes, but also I think gives us credibility when we go to bat for the issues that, you know, we care about and that are important to the peninsula, you know, in Olympia.
Thank you. Mike?
Yeah, you know, thanks everyone for being here, and thanks Colleen for inviting us. It's you know, I'm sure we want to get to your questions, and I think today's more about a question and answer than look. Steve and I just spent 6 months talking had nauseam about what we think. So I do want to get to your questions. I want to follow up just maybe on Steve's point. You know, the 24th LD is basic. It's either 1 or 2 for voter registration per capita. It'll be 1 or 2 in the primary. It was the #1 turnout. So more voters voted in the 24th legislative district in the primary than in any other legislative district. I'm just thumbing through. I mean, we're right there, kind of dominating again. So that shows that, again, like Steve said, we have and we have 3 counties, and now people forget we now represent a majority of the voters in Grays Harbor County. We used to just represent a portion of Grays Harbor. We now represent about 80% of the voters in Grays Harbor County. So it's 3 very diverse districts. I mean, you know, you can go through the numbers. Jefferson County, of course, you know, we're getting 72%, Clallam County 53, 54, and Grays Harbor is 50-50. I think, you know, one of the issues around, like when we meet with like your guy, you know, the economy, small business growth, it doesn't matter if we're in downtown Port Townsend or downtown Hoquiam. The small businesses issues are the same. And I think that it's, you know, it got kind of wrapped up maybe in politics and the blue and red stuff. But I got to be honest, the restaurant owner in Port Townsend dealt with the same concerns as the restaurant owner in Montesano. And we listened to them. And we, you know, did the state handle the last 2 years perfectly? Heck no. Did anybody handle the last 2 years perfectly? Did you handle your own budget perfectly? Like, the last 2 years were a major earthquake in society, but the state never just kind of threw our hands up. Steve and I would meet with you and we would say, yeah, we hear the challenges, but I don't think we ever threw our hands up and just gave up. Nor did we really attack other people. Like, we weren't attacking other representatives, other districts, other elected officials. We were trying to work and find solutions. So, you know, with a diverse district and a big district, I just want to say it doesn't really matter where the issues were the issues. And I think just society and maybe this election, you know, a lot of pundits out this morning, this, you know, what did yesterday mean just nationally? I mean, everybody kind of expected it was going to be this tsunami against Democrats. And really, it turns out that my takeaway is if you're a good representative for the area or the job that you were elected to, you won. If you were a Democrat in a purple area, but you were doing a good job, it looks like they won. If you were a senator in a state, it looks like they won. And I think that's, you know, that's the message I take. Headlines and speeches are meaningless. Who's rolling up their sleeves and getting the work done? And I'd like to think that Steve and I have, you know, kind of proven that we can get some things done for this district. Was it perfect? Did everybody? No. And there's more to do. And we have some, that's when we get to your questions. We have a lot of challenges moving forward. But case in point, one of the, you know, just one thing that we got done the last 4 years that I think has been completely well, most of you know this. There were 2 hospitals in Washington state that got extra appropriations from the state. 2. And they were Grays Harbor Community Hospital and Olympic Medical Center. Now, how did the 24th legislative district get extra major appropriations to our 2 community, you know, public hospitals? Was it because Steve and I are making great speeches on the floor? No, I'm known as giving the shortest speeches on the floor. Was it because we come from a district that denigrates Olympia and denigrated you know? No, it's because we rolled up our sleeves and Steve and Kevin working on the right committee and some of your support and the Olympic Medical Center board and, you know, all that went into that. Now, can we continue to do that? I don't know, but we have a track record if our district had needs of being able to find the way to help. And I think Steve's point of the voices that we bring from rural Clallam County, rural Jefferson County, rural Grays Harbor County are voices that are desperately needed in Olympia and in the majority caucus. If we weren't, if it was somebody else sitting here this morning talking about their victory, they would have been in the deep minority based on the results in a blue state. But the voices of the North Olympic Peninsula would be a lot different. And I think that, this is a team effort. I've said it the whole campaign, from EDCs to chambers to boards of commissioners to school. I mean, everybody, we're all in this together representing this district and working hard. And I'd like to think that, our message was we've rolled up our sleeves and we'll continue to roll up our sleeves, try to get some things done for the district. We can't do it all. We can't deliver on every request. But you know what? Significantly, this district has been better off through the leadership. And I think the voters, again, if you were doing a good job as an elected official, you got reelected last night. And as someone who's elected, that actually feels really good. Like, it felt like we were rewarded not because we were a Democrat in a Democrat district or a Republican. We were rewarded because I think we do a good job. And we're not going to change. I'm more pragmatic, maybe more moderate on some issues. It's not like I'm going to change my approach to this job. And so anyway, those are my initial thoughts.
Thanks, Mike. I want to share screen for just a minute to show everybody just how diverse our district is. So can you all see this now? Yeah. Okay. So here's our district, and it's not all of the county in Grays Harbor. It's more than half, right? But the other half of Grays Harbor that moves in down south is a different district, I think 19th, and they elected Republicans there as their representatives. But when you look by county, two things I want to point out. One is 24,000 votes came from Clallam County, and Grays Harbor and Jefferson is about 27,000 votes. So the vast majority of the voters, anyway, to this point, are in Clallam County. But and you can see that Jefferson votes much heavier Democratic, Grays Harbor a bit more Republican, and Clallam, I think, we're typically a purple county that goes back and forth, and we obviously swung further to support our existing legislators. And here's Steve Tharinger's race. Again, about 2,000 votes ahead in Clallam, Steve Tharinger. Grays Harbor slightly behind, but again, Jefferson County, 7,000 votes or so. Jefferson County is predictably votes Democrat more so than Clallam, and especially more so than Grays Harbor. So that's just as they talk about the diversified district. It's very blue to the east, and then moves more red as you move to the southwest. But just a little bit in case people hadn't seen that on that website yet. That's the Secretary of State website. Does anybody want to kick off with one of the first questions? I know my first question would be, can you share with us what your, say, top 2 or 3 priorities are going to be as the legislative session begins the second Monday in January, if I recall correctly? So I think it's January 9th. I say that, and I'm not sure if I got that right, but I think that's correct, that it'll begin, January 9th. Does Steve or Mike, do you guys want to share what your top 2 or 3 priorities will be to work on in the legislative session for us?
Yeah, so, this is, as folks know, this is the first year of the biennium. So this is the budget year where we write the budgets for the biennium. And things are tightening up as folks are in their own pocketbooks, in their own households. They're feeling that, and that's certainly what's going to happen in the state. We've had, pretty robust budgets because of the sales tax during COVID was high, And then there were the federal relief dollars that came through the state. So we've the last couple biennium has been, have been robust, and certainly on the capital budget side, which folks know, I chair the committee in the House. So that's what I spend a lot of my time with, almost, probably 4 or 5 hours a day. Once the session starts after the first week, that's what I'm doing. So those numbers will tighten also. And I think it'll still be, very strong. I think the budgets will be really strong, but they're not going to be as strong as they've been. So we're going to have to sharpen our pencils and do what we can to maintain services. I think one of the issues that everyone's facing, you're facing that in your own business, in your own, whether it's the county or the city, or is workforce. And there's a number of factors going into that. Part of it is the demographics, the baby boomers are retiring. Part of it is COVID. People learn different ways to work. Part of it is, we have a training challenge, and we have a certification challenge in the state. We just really have very high bars, kind of whether you're a social worker. And we'd like to get, I think, more social workers, more behavioral health people working with our law enforcement and in our community health settings. I see Dr. Maxwell here. I mean, in healthcare, it's a huge challenge. And part of that is the state certifications are pretty high. They're pretty stringent. And part of that's a labor issue. And part of that is we want to make sure we have quality folks. But I think we can take a look and see if we can maybe adjust some of those requirements, the amount of time, the number of hours you need for that certification, and provide a little more flexibility without losing the quality of that workforce. So nothing real fancy, nothing real, big headlines, but really, I think, good basic, government policy that helps us strengthen our workforce and maintains that our budget, so that it's kind of a, you hear it a lot, but building the economy from the middle out, I think, is one of the challenges we face here in Washington. People at the lower end, they get a lot of services. There's actually relief for them. We don't have to worry about the people at the upper end, but there's a lot of challenges, whether you're running a motel or whether you're, a medical assistant or a teacher. Those are challenging. It's challenging to find housing. The wages are tough to keep up with inflation. So I think just focusing on making government a little more flexible and addressing those needs is through the budget process. As folks know, I'm also on the appropriations committee and the healthcare committee. So how those link together, how we fund the clinics and whether it be behavioral health or dental clinics or the other things, we're making those capital investments, I think, will be kind of my focus, as it has been for a while.
Great, thank you.
So super quick on excuse me, I serve on the transportation committee, so I'll continue to work to make sure the funding for the Squim to Blinn project, we continue to keep that on track. Senator Vandewey and I are going to work on our appropriation to get the Morse Creek project finished up. They didn't finish it because of COVID, so we need to get that resurfaced and probably do a little better job with the landscaping through there. That's kind of been an embarrassment. And then obviously, I really do believe we'll be starting construction on the new Elwha Bridge. And I think that's an important, and we have some other projects down south. But as the chair, and I'm, there was some rumor that somehow I wouldn't, I wasn't going to, return as chair. I'll be the chair of the Ag and Natural Resource Committee. Next week, I get a chance to address the Washington State Farm Bureau at their annual convention. And one of the frustrations as the chair of the committee is that, especially with regards to agriculture and farming, usually legislation might be introduced, and then the lobbyists for the ag community, they kind of come in and they're kind of playing defense. And my message going forward, and something that I'm becoming very passionate about, is number one, Washington feeds the world. Washington farmers produce copious amounts of food, and in today's inflationary times, and with other countries being blown to smithereens and their wheat being brought off the market and other crops, Washington has an opportunity to be a worldwide leader. And my message to the Farm Bureau, and something that I'm really what will be my focus, is not gee, what's the legislature going to do to the ag community that's negative? I want to hear from the ag community, and especially our farmers and our cattle producers and our grain and fruit. I mean, we produce every type of food imaginable in this state. What can the legislature do to ease the regulatory or expense burden so you can increase production? What is it we can do in the labor arena, in the expense arena? And I want to have a conversation as the chair of the committee that actually can move policies forward. And really, this is something that never is, very seldom do we really consider. We think of Washington, high tech, Microsoft, Starbucks, coffee, we're all caffeinated. But the rest, and even on the North Olympic Peninsula with our aquaculture, the growth of aquaculture and the amount of seafood that we produce commercially is stunning in throughout our district. And I was just down in Southwest Washington earlier this week, working on some tricky issues around salmon and salmon production. Toured a cannery, was blown away at the amount of seafood that was running through that cannery every day. I was there for an hour, and I was like, wow, this is and that was one cannery in one community. So Washington is going to be, and I think that in today's world that that's something that I'm going to work on, promote, and see what we can do so that Washington takes the next step. One little tidbit that nobody probably knows. I know I didn't know it until, I met with the raspberry growers. Washington State's the #1 producer in the world of raspberries up in Whatcom County. It's the raspberry capital of the world. And how you ever wonder how they get raspberries in those little boxes without them all being, like, you ever pick a raspberry and you're like, they crush it in their finger. How do they get them in boxes? The machinery they have is amazing. It's got these little fingers and it gently shakes them. And then they collect them in soft bags and then gently put them and package them. But it is something, and during drought years and those sorts of things, so we have to make sure we have enough water. Anyway, it's like you get chair of a committee and then you learn all this stuff, and now you're like responsible for all, to make sure that we have a thriving. But I think we all like to eat. Generally, we eat a lot of good food that comes right out of Washington State, especially in our local restaurants. The whole economy around our local restaurants with local. Anyway, enough said. I think you get the idea.
Thanks, Mike. I see Colleen Robinson has her hand up. Colleen?
Good morning. Congratulations, Mike and Steve. Thanks for being here this morning. Guess what? I'm going to ask about affordable housing. Habitat Clallam has 10 acres in Sequim that we are beginning development on, thanks to the City of Sequim Council passing multifamily zoning. As a rural community, Washington State Commerce and Housing Trust Fund dollars are a challenge to apply for. The applications are overwhelming, and the follow-up reporting. And unlike my colleagues on the I-5 corridor, we do not have a resource development department or a dedicated grant writer. It all falls to me. What can you do now as our re-elected officials to help rural communities have technical assistance and support in applying for those applications so we can get this land developed and start building affordable workforce housing? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, as you know, Colleen, a lot of the dollars we budget through the capital budget for housing goes through Commerce, and they process a lot. I mean, I will say there is a burden, and it certainly is an effort. I really appreciate the work you do and a lot of folks do to try to package together the different funding sources. There is some thought that if someone can't fill out the applications, then can they really execute the project? We sometimes, when I was chair of the Salmon Recovery Funding Board, we used to think we get a lot of complaints about how long it took to do the application, but in some ways, it was a way to call out the folks that maybe couldn't even, if they couldn't execute the application, maybe they couldn't execute the project. But you're right, there is a burden. It is, I think, working with Commerce to help them have technical assistance. We do that on, sewer and water projects. There's teams that come out of the different agencies, particularly the Public Works Board and CURB, that help them, communities that don't have that, capacity to help develop the projects. And so we can look at that. I don't know if Habitat, statewide Habitat, or the organizations, the larger organization could also provide some of that technical expertise, but I realize it is a challenge, and it's kind of working with Commerce to see if we can streamline it. It's a little difficult though to do one thing for one area and not do it for the other, right? So we've got to find that balance across the state so that there is some, because people start looking, well, that person had a 2-page application and we have 15 pages. What's the deal? So we got to find that balance. But I think the key is probably working with Commerce and getting them to have a technical assistant, sort of a traveling technical team that can help smaller jurisdictions execute the project.
Thanks, Steve. Mike, do you have any thoughts on it?
Well, it's obviously, it's not just you and it's not just Habitat. I'm actually been working with a constituent for the last month. They're trying to file some paperwork just with the Secretary of State's office for their local homeowners association. So obviously the bureaucracy of state government is not always the most friendly. We've also, I think, Steve and I also heard it when we met with the school superintendents, that for big schools, it's easy for them to apply for the new funds for school counselors and nurses, but for Brennan and Quilcene and some of the smaller school districts, that was a challenge. So one of the things that, if you know the agency you're dealing with, I mean, we're having some luck meeting, with the school superintendent of public instruction. They're aware now that these small districts need some help, and he may put in a budget proviso for a staff person to assist with grant writing for small school districts. I know I talked for about an hour with the representative of the Secretary of State's office with the paperwork for the homeowners association. So I think that if you could direct us to what agency and what the drawback is, what these agencies may be willing to do is actually hire someone to help small groups apply for these funds. They want to get, like the state, the state agencies want to get the funds out, and they don't want it all to go to the Seattle and I-5 corridor, but they do have a process. But they are aware and painfully aware that they've been shorthanded, and they want to help. So I think it's a budget issue, and I think it's directing. I know the superintendent, he's going to ask for help, a position. I think that makes some sense, like somebody to directly help small school districts apply for the funds that the legislature has appropriated. So I don't know, Colleen, if you could point us where the agency is the hang up and what the hang up is, we can, I certainly can work on that with you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jim McIntyre has his hand up. Jim.
Thank you. Congratulations to both. Topic, just to continue on the Colleen's thread of thought, there is housing supply. Of course, mortgage rates going up, read newspaper articles about the overall chill on new housing starts, maybe not so much for multifamily housing, but for single family housing for certain. And so I guess looking ahead, there is maybe an opportunity here to put our feet up on our desk, think about how do we position the state once we get into a little bit more benign interest rate environment, when the Fed finally conquers inflation. How do we incentivize, or at least remove the barriers for additional housing supply? Like you said, Mike, I think the higher end, the custom home contracts and so forth, those will kind of take care of themselves. There's provision for the lower end of the housing market for those less well off, the below median household income families and so on. But for the middle part of the housing spectrum, that's the private sector. How do we think about positioning ourselves so in a year's time, maybe a year and a half time, once the housing market starts to turn up, once the construction market starts to turn up, how do we achieve a higher rate of housing supply building?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, Jim. And it's a challenge. I think there's a couple of ways we look at it. Obviously, on the capital budget, we're making investments in, and you've heard me mention this in infrastructure, sewer and water. There's this community housing infrastructure plan called CHIP that we fund that, you know, gets the infrastructure to the land base so that part of those costs are diminished for the developer. I think zoning is another way to look at it, you know, increasing density in areas where that infrastructure is available. You know, roads, sewer, water, transportation. And I will say that it looks like, you know, the building code advisory committee is going the other way. They're increasing costs for, I think, good reasons to some extent, you know, basically get people away from natural gas and into heat pumps and electrical appliances. But that's going to add some costs. Obviously, you know, in the jurisdictions around the 24th, I think Jefferson County and Port Townsend are sort of notorious for kind of taking forever to get the permit process. Colleen, she referred to that with her habitat project. So I think getting jurisdictions to look at the permitting process, and so funding for the infrastructure, looking at, you know, zoning so that we can do density by design that I think is more economical and for housing, and then looking at some of the permitting processes to try and streamline those. A lot of those decisions are at the local level. And I think the communities in our district, certainly I know City of Port Townsend and Jefferson County are looking at it. Clallam has been pretty good. I think, and with the new DCD director, I think you'll see that even improve. No one answer, but I think it's a focus, and I really think you're right that middle band has been sort of ignored. We've been doing a lot for folks that have, you know, low income, and higher end obviously takes care of itself, but it is that middle band that we need to focus on.
Great.
Well, I mean, Jim, as a former port commissioner and county commissioner, you know, we've dealt the infrastructure, the sewer, the water, those sorts of things. I think one of my core tenets has traditionally been local control. Try not to push too much down on the state to the local. But I think that maybe as we move forward, I do think maybe the cities, especially, I mean, that's where you're going to put some decent middle income housing is in your cities, because they've already got the sewer and the water rights. You look at the city of Port Angeles, excess capacity of the sewer and water, I think, you know, swim. But you drive around, and one of the, you know, do we need to require the cities to change some of their zoning around the main routes? I mean, I'm not advocating for this, and it's right around the corner from where I live. But when I do drive up and down 8th Avenue in Port Angeles, you know, two blocks north of 8th Avenue is a three-story apartment building. But along 8th Avenue, it's really just the old single family homes that have been converted to usually some sort of small business. But should there be a requirement that as that usage changes, that we require more dense housing along that route? The bus runs, there's water, there's sewer, and it's not going to block really anybody's view. That's a commercial corridor that is all single height and no housing. And I think the cities, though they'll traditionally lobby against the state, kind of requiring cities to look at these corridors all around the state, everybody's kind of waking up and realize. Another thing is, show me one mini storage that isn't being built on prime commercial property on a bus route, usually near water and sewer, that could be incredibly useful for denser housing. Now, I'm not against mini storages. I've never used one, but we've got to be a little smarter than this in permitting these uses, and then wondering why in the hell can't we put more affordable, denser housing? Well, we're not going to put it out in Klein, out in the Squim Valley. We're not plopping it down out there, a 3-story apartment building, you know, in the Squim Valley. But you could smart use of the resources we have. And I know the city of Squim has some excess, you know, last I heard they have excess capacity. So we may have to kind of require our local governments to be a little smarter in some of their planning. Otherwise, we're going to be here in 10 years still asking the same question, because right now, where would you put a 3-story apartment or condo building that was affordable? Somebody tell me, like, where is it not going in because of, you know, where it's going to go in the city of Port Angeles or in the city limits of Sequim or in the city limits of Port Townsend or Hoquiam. It's not going west of Port Angeles or east in the valley, right? So there's some talk of trying to, and some city council members will push back, but other city council members are saying, state, we may need you to regulate us, to nudge us, because when we draft these rules and we go to public hearing, we're overwhelmed with opposition. But if it's a state requirement, that gives them a little cover. So we'll see. I'm not, again, it's asking me outside of my comfort zone. But if we just talk about it and don't actually put some concrete action, nothing's going to change. And I think there's missed opportunities, and we put a lot of money into our municipal water and sewer systems. Now, I'm not running any of them. I don't know if they're full, if they have capacity, but that's up for this, up to the cities. But anyway, just some thought. It's a very frustrating issue, believe me. And, the reality is probably most of us, no way could I buy my house I live in right now. There's no way. And I make a solid middle-class income with me and my wife. She runs her business. I mean, but there's no way. We've looked at it. And with today's interest rates, that's kind of messed up. That's not fair. So we'll see, there's a tough issue.
Great. Thanks, Mike. So Dr. Maxwell.
Yeah, hello, good morning, thank you, and congratulations, Steve and Mike, and glad to have your voices and experience in Olympia continue. Just first a comment, Steve, I really appreciate your perspective about finding ways, innovative ways to improve the healthcare workforce a bit, especially around behavioral health, and looking at the certification and that sort of regulatory elements that can sometimes protract or create barriers to getting the workforce through the pipeline and into communities a little faster. So I like those ideas. So continue to encourage you to look at that. And then just secondly, I wonder, I think both of you are probably aware that with the public health emergency, that there were a lot of lower wage workers who got access to healthcare through Medicaid that are scheduled to lose it as soon as the public health emergency ends. I think I heard an estimate between 10 and 20% of current Medicaid enrollees are going to lose that coverage at the end line of the public health emergency. I'm just wondering if you see is that on the legislature's radar, and do you see a role, if any, in the legislature of how to address that if there a potential bolus of uninsured workers in the community?
Yeah, another great question, Mike. The situation is we have, I think Washington has kind of low Medicaid reimbursement rates. They were bumped up with the recovery money. As I mentioned earlier, I think the budget cycle is going to be a challenge. Pencils are going to have to be sharpened. We have, in talking to, I haven't seen all the numbers, but talking to the budget writers, we have, another piece of the McCleary settlement that goes to teachers. I think that's a 5% increase, and that's a pretty big chunk of dough. And then we have collective bargaining agreements that, which are also with the inflation factor, are also going to be challenging. And for me, the next category is Medicaid rates. To try across the board, whether it's for long-term care, whether it's for mental health, whether it's for just being able to visit clinics. We've been as a state considerably, we've held those numbers down, and I think they need to come up. The question will be, where does that money come from? And as folks may know, the way the state budgets is we have a 2-year budget, which is pretty locked in, but there's then the 4-year outlook. And that's, I think, where our challenge is, that if revenue for the end of this budget year, this fiscal year through June I think is up. But when you project out into the 4-year, it's down about 250 million. And so, that will be a challenge for budget writers in Olympia. But I do think that the Medicaid rates, trying to at least hold that bump so that people don't go backwards, I think is a priority for folks. And, I would like to see some increases across the board for Medicaid, whether we can get there or not. I will say, there's some dominoes that happen within leadership now across the committee chairs and the caucus leadership and things like that. And one of the major ones is Representative Eileen Cody, who's chaired the Health and Wellness Committee in the House, has actually been a national leader on healthcare policy. She's retiring, so we're going to have a new chair in the Health and Wellness on the House side. And she was great. I mean, she was a national leader in healthcare policy, but she did really keep Medicaid rates pretty low. And, she kind of prided herself with that. So she's not going to be there. So I think there is some opportunity, if the dollars are there, to be able to focus some money on those rates and bring them up so they're a little more comparable with other states. I mean, that's just a huge challenge. I mean, that's a population that's really is challenged in a lot of ways. We've kind of been talking about that with the economy this morning, but I think healthcare and the access to those services is super important.
Just add, and I shouldn't add anything because I'm not an expert, and Mike, you are, but then that leads to what I want to add, that it really, in the rural areas, we're more our clientele, your clientele is more reliant upon Medicaid and Medicare, and versus like in the I-5 corridor where they have more of a private payer mix. Now, this is just information that is out there and that I've been given. And I think when these rates were kind of looked at, it was looked at through the lens of the I-5 corridor, where there's a lot of private payer mix. And so when we look at the rural areas and Medicaid and Medicare reimbursements, well, what we need, Mike, and we have it through OMC, but we've got to make sure that OMC and Grays Harbor and you're telling the story of who are your clients, not just I need more money for Medicare or Medicaid, but as you meet, and meeting with Steve and Kevin and I is going to be great, but you're going to have to meet with some of those I-5 that are other members that are on the committee and explain to them, hey, I get in your community, 80, maybe 60, 70, 80% are private insurance, but in my community, whatever the number is, and here's what happens when I'm not getting paid enough. Here's the services I'm not providing. And at the end of the day, they may end up showing up in your hospital. Now, Josh at Summit Pacific, he told me he's been very close to turning away people at Summit because he was over capacity in the Medicaid patients and sending them to Tacoma. So, that's the reality that he was looking at, and he's been pretty frustrated. Josh with Summit, and a great advocate for these issues and a leader in rural healthcare. So I think that's help you, tell the story, but it's not just we need more money. Everybody. So we're going to have to be smarter in that. And I said the same thing to Josh when I saw him last week, and he's putting together a team that's going to really be focused, I believe, on that. I think every hospital and every healthcare, I think you need to make this a focus of raising the alarm, but explaining what it means, what can't you do, or where, does that make sense? And maybe I'm wrong, but that's kind of what Josh is thinking.
No, you're right on. You're right. It's the story. Appreciate the advocacy.
Thanks, Dr. Maxwell. Melanie.
Good morning. Nice to see you. Congratulations, Rep. Tharinger and Chapman. So I'm going to actually circle back a little bit to what Colleen Robinson's question was about capacity to apply for all of this federal funding that's on the table right now. I joined a number of folks on this call last week at an energy futures workshop that NODC put on to outline the North Olympic Peninsula's needs for energy infrastructure. And I know some of that was driven home last week and this weekend for those of you who lost power, that there are great needs. And I can say I was really impressed by the collaborative kind of can-do spirit of the North Olympic Peninsula. And I think that this region could serve as a model for other rural communities, but it also, everybody drove home capacity, 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 just like Colleen was saying. The communities that need this funding most have the least capacity to apply, to manage large grants, to implement projects. You've all been talking about this, but this is a huge time for federal funding. We heard from Department of Energy and USDA and others about all this funding on the table in the next few years. And so I just wanted to know if you had any other thoughts about how the state might be able to help prepare communities across the board for that federal funding that's on the table right now.
Yeah, it's another great question, Millie. Good to see you. I think that I'm one of the things that's scheduled for me this week, or I think next week, is to work with my capital budget staff and take a look at that and see how we position ourselves as a state for accessing the money that was in the Inflation Reduction Act. And the state is also, that we're going to be generating some revenue from the cap and trade program on carbon reduction. A lot of that goes to transportation. Some of it goes to the tribes, and some of it is going to communities that are really impacted. Think of basically the I-5 corridor around Harbor Island and in areas where there's really, or Pierce County, where there's, because of the port down there, where there's just a lot of traffic and there's a lot of bad air quality. But I think some of those dollars will also be available for rural energy resilience, if you will, and making that transition. I'm not up to speed, quite frankly, right now on the IRA money. As to my understanding, it's a lot of tax credits, so it's kind of a long-term investment sort of thing. But we, as you know, through PNNL, making investments with the Department of Energy in transmission and in storage, research, and science. So this is, I think, a long-term sort of process. And it really does, I think, take, I'll take just broadband for an example. Jefferson County's really been a leader. They have put together a package of probably about $35 million worth to serve some of the underserved areas with broadband. And that's really what it takes, is the initiative has to come from a little bit from the bottom up. Certainly the state has to help with positioning and having match dollars with the federal dollars, but really you need to have kind of a strategy at a local level. And if you guys have that strategy, we can step in and help. I don't know at this point whether there are dollars to help develop that strategy for the locals, but certainly, a strategic approach that shows what you're trying to do, what the costs are going to be, what sort of the time frame is I think the way to move forward. But there's this is going to be a lot of focus, I think, in capital budget work, is to try to make sure we don't leave any of that federal money on the table, and that the dollars do get to the areas of the state. Kind of the theme we've had this morning is, we don't, for a number of reasons, well, we don't have the technical expertise or the matching funds, or just to really, in the rural areas, the 24th on the peninsula, to access those dollars, be competitive with those dollars. So we need to be thinking about that and structuring programs that address that.
I'll add quickly so we can get into the next, and I'll do my best to be quickly. But Melanie, the fact that PNNL may be having some issues says a lot, because you guys probably are as robust a staff as possible and some of the smartest people on the planet. So if you're having a hard time figuring it out, Steve and I yesterday were at the new dike project in Squim on the Dungeness River, and this issue came up with regards to projects like the dike removal and building a new dike and all the funds that went into it, and it was discussed how challenging it can be to access those funds. But I understand it can't be so challenging the funds don't come back to our community. But conversely, and it was brought out, some of that is to make sure that the people that are accessing your tax dollars are qualified and capable of using the tax dollars in a way that is meaningful and does what it was meant to be, that we don't want to make it so easy. And we see, issues of fraudulent activity. And so these aren't going to be one-page applications that anybody with a business license can apply for $1 million grant. So there is a strategy to make sure that the dollars get to where they need to, but it is potentially in places too cumbersome. I think my thought is to make sure that the state agencies have the people in place as well to assist our constituents. Not that you have to hire more people, but that maybe the state needs to do a better and can do a better job. And that's part of the customer service. So just some thoughts, but yeah, it's kind of bothersome that PNNL is having problems.
Well, I was actually talking about the community needs. We're keeping our eyes out, and in some cases, we're able to bring some federal dollars in for that technical assistance for communities. So we were interested to learn what the challenges were, and we'll continue to keep our eyes out. But definitely heard from community organizations that you all need help with grant writing and feasibility studies, and
if you're a
managing
trained
large
grant
projects.
writer right now, you probably can make a good living. If you're an experienced grant writer.
Maybe Peninsula College can help us to train more. It's going to be a good.
Is that a field
path.
of study? Is that a thing? Can you get a certification in grant writing?
I'm not sure. We'll have to look into that, but there's certainly a lot of grant writers. It'd be good business right now. Thank you very much.
I did put in the chat some information about the EDA's Economic Recovery Program, which basically is available to different states, and Washington State is not one of them. It's example, Mississippi, giving them support so that they can compete for these federal funds. But I'd love to see Washington State create something similar to that, so that more impoverished areas could have some technical support to be able to compete, so we can address this capacity issue. And there, like I said, there is a model there from EDA, and I put that in the chat. Superintendent Marty Brewer, Port Angeles School District. Oh, you're still on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Congratulations, Mike and Steve. Job well done once again. I'm going to ask a question or make a couple of statements based on school funding. So regionalization has proven to be a really challenging funding model for at least the non-regionalization districts across the state of Washington. It's squeezing us pretty tight. In fact, I think across the state, I'm not just speaking to, schools in our region, we're going to see layoffs or rifts like maybe educators haven't seen in the spring ever before. In Port Angeles, we're looking at anywhere from $4 to $5 million in cuts. And I know the regionalization model is a tough nut to crack. But there's a couple of things that could really help school districts outside of the regionalization model. Fully funding SPED. We use our EP&O levy to fund nearly $2 million of out-of-pocket cost for SPED services. And that appears to me to be, basic education, needs of a child. And then the other thing that is really squeezing school districts across our region and state is the IPD. The IPD is based on, the prototypical model, which is not what it takes to run schools. And so this last year, the 5.5% that was allocated from the state really looked like about 2.16% when we allocated it to all of our groups. So we had to come up with hundreds of thousands of dollars just to meet what the state outlined as IPD flow through. So those are two things that are top on the initiative for educators across the state of Washington. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, just briefly, Marty, I think there was a discussion around the regionalization. You guys, I think folks are starting to hear that, and there are some issues. I'm not involved with those discussions, but I hear people are. It is that funding model is problematic for a number of folks. So, and there will be, I think, some discussion around, I'm not on the education committee, so I'm not in those details, but we'll certainly come to the appropriations committee. But I would, amp up your input, if you will, because I think it is on people's screens and people are talking about it and trying to look at ways to make it work better for schools. A lot of the school funding formulas, certainly on the capital side, we're also looking at that, realizing that the formula is old and it doesn't really address the issues. And I think that's the same on the operating side. So whether that'll lead to success or solving the problems of, as you know, there's kind of incremental wins in this, but yeah, I think since you brought it up to me the last time we talked, I've mentioned it to some folks. They said there are people working on it, the regionalization piece.
I'll just add that all these issues, I mean, the funding for basic education in 2017, the piece that finally passed was a bipartisan bill. It was actually a Republican Senate bill. And it had bipartisan support and had bipartisan opposition. And I think that, and people forget that, like, bipartisanship is both support and opposition. You know, there are times where the far left and the far right are the ones voting no, and it's the middle folks that cobble together. And I think moving forward, I think during the pandemic, some of the tweaks we made to education funding became a little more partisan. And I think as we move back, and I think as the legislature, it is a broader issue, but as the legislature comes back in person next year, some of these issues that were bipartisan need to get back to being bipartisan. I think the Zoom world kind of exasperated the partisanship a little bit too much in Olympia. And so that's some of the goal. I think Steve and I feel like that's something that we've got, that we run our committees in a bipartisan way. We need the other committees to work. So this, whatever solution moves forward, I'm going to be looking to make sure that it's a pragmatic bipartisan solution and not just, winners and losers, and we'll see where that goes. But the whole education funding has been an interesting journey. And, if you kind of track through the legislature, you'd see different iterations along the way. It's not that the legislature certainly puts its head in the sand and, wiped our hands and said, we're done after the initial bill. We have made adjustments along the way because it is significant legislation and it's the significant driver of the state budget. And it is the paramount duty of our state budget. So we're not perfect. It hasn't been perfect, but I think the solution is a bipartisan solution, hopefully.
Great, thank you. Let's see. Oh gosh, it's 9 o'clock. Dale, I see Dale has his hand up. I'll let him take the last question.
Thanks, Colleen. Steve, it was nice to meet you last week at the CTE meeting. I understand that the biennial capital budget is 8% of the operating budget, and about 35% of that has to go to school bonds, which leaves only about 5% of the operating budget available for capital. And can you explain, so I'm thinking about that as a backdrop, and can you explain the process for how the legislature determines what projects will be funded and how much each district will receive and how much the state agencies will receive?
Yeah, so Dale, the way this works is the Constitution says that the capital budget, therefore the bonds that support the capital budget can't be greater than 10% of the revenue coming in. It's not the budget itself, but the revenue coming in. And usually we've been working in the realm of between 7 and 8%. We never get close, at least as long as I've been chair. And so, and this year it'll probably be a little bit lower. Probably, I think we were at 7.4 or something, 7.3. So we'll be closer to 7, I think, as we package build our budget. So we look at that number, what it would generate, and then we look at, the capital expenditures across the state. It is under the school construction assistance program. We are required to cover whatever bonds are passed at the local level. And during the recession or during COVID, there were very few of those. And so we had sort of extra dollars within our bonding capacity. That'll probably go up, but it varies. But roughly K-12 and 2-year and 4-year schools are close to half of the capital budget. The investments we make in schools and in community colleges and in the 4-year institutions. And then the rest of it is divided. Basically, the budget's built around, the governor comes out with a budget in December. We use that as a draft, but as you've heard Mike and I say, you know, the governor is just negotiating with himself. So his budget's a little aspirational. We have to actually, you know, if you remember your civics, the legislative branch does the true appropriation. So we go through each of the agencies starting with the governor's budget, and then make additions and deletions, and then try to direct funds through our competitive programs, and so that people compete with those within those programs, whether it's building for the arts, whether it's heritage funds, whether it's libraries, whether it's a lot of dollars go into the Washington Wildlife and Recreation Program. There's just a number of programs, and we work down a lot of those lists to determine, what the funding level will be depending on the funds that are available.
So Steve, does that each district though get a bucket of funding that's kind of open-ended for those
No.
legislators to decide on how they want to spend the money?
No, there is so projects that are brought forward that do not fit into one of the categories, like a library category or a dental clinic library category. We have what are called local community projects, and we have an amount. So the budget writers both in the four corners, basically. So the Senate R's and D's and the House R's and D's, when we kind of agree to what a number might be for that category, and that leads to what you could call as legislator appropriations, or earmarks might be a word that people would could relate to. But that number, there's a sort of a number that's assigned to that after we've looked at a lot of the other numbers. So it's a very time-consuming and fluid negotiated process. But I think in the last couple biennium, we've had in that category per chamber, I think there's been around $80 million for those LCPs.
Because Steve's the chair, I double up my requests. I always have more requests than will ever be funded. I'm a big fan of projects getting funded.
The 24th district has done pretty well under my chairmanship. There are some advantages to chairing the committee. I'll say that.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for all of your time. We're quite a bit over 9:06, and we really appreciate your work on our behalf and also coming here today. So with that, I'm going to stop the recording.